This Ramadan, I have teamed up with HCI Canada and fundraising for Gaza. The Palestinian people are in urgent need of help. Many are starved, injured, many of those are children. I would appreciate it if you could donate what you can and share the link with family and friends so it can reach to more people. May Allah bless you. Bismillah. Okay, it's been such a long time. The reason behind that is I just needed a break away from posting and things because you know what's going on in Gaza. It just has had a lot of impact on me. Basically, I don't want to talk about me because what they are going through is so much worse. I feel like, this is not about me, and I want the focus to be on Gaza. I don't want to talk about how I felt and how this has affected me. Yes, it has affected me strongly, and yes, it's hard for me to even make these videos, and it's hard for me to see all these things and post it and talk about it, and it's hard, but I understand that sometimes we have to do it, for them and for their sake, to raise awareness and talk about these hard subjects. I know it's so hard, but this is why I am doing this. I'm really trying, and if you can, I would appreciate it so much if you could donate. I just started fundraising for Gaza. If you follow me, I'm sure you have maybe seen it, maybe not, I don't know, because it's hard to reach to people, and I know Instagram, Facebook, all these social media is blocking these kind of videos. I hope, inshallah, we can come together as Muslims. This is our duty as Muslims, is to help other Muslims and help other people who are struggling, and not just watch them suffer. And especially during Ramadan, this is the time, so don't delay. Help as much you can. Thank you for supporting. Jazakallah khair. In today's video, I will react to Piers interviewing Mehdi Hassan. I have to say, Piers is brave for having him on this show. So it will be interesting to watch this video. So let's start.
I want you to imagine that you are the Prime Minister of Israel when that atrocity happens. What do?
That's a great question.
How else do you get rid of Hamas if you don't go about it in the blunt, brutal manner that Israel is doing?
I don't accept the premise of your question that this is the way to defeat Hamas. I think your questions reflect a little bit of a naivety about what Israel's doing here.
People do ask me, do you think Israel are terrorists? And I've said no. But I have repeated.
Why?
Well, I have repeated because I think they.
Out of interest, why?
Because they were responding to an act of terrorism so heinous it demanded a massive military response.
No, what is happening right now is act of terrorism.
When did Israel kill?
What we need to have is.
Well, hang on. When did Israel kill 1,200
When did Israel kill hundreds of
Palestinians?
Palestinians a million?
Were you fired by MSNBC because of what you said? Well, now Mehdi's joined the US Guardian, using his first column to call Israel's offensive a genocide. Also started his own media company, Zateo News. His New York Times bestseller, Win Every Argument, was notably written before he'd appeared on this show. And now Mehdi Hassan is uncensored. Mehdi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for that introduction, Piers.
We've had a few ding-dongs on X, formerly Twitter, over the years. Recently, I've noticed a pattern where you've started a few tweets saying, I hate to admit this, but I agree with Piers Morgan.
Yeah, you've said some sensible things about the conflict in the Middle East. You've said some sensible things about Islamophobia. I feel like you've matured over the years.
I've been following what's happened with you with great interest. And as somebody who was at CNN and left there pretty abruptly myself a few years ago after a series of very lively debates with members of the NRA about gun rights in America, you know, I could see what happened with you, and we'll come to that a little later. But first of all, how are you enjoying the freedom of your new life?
Very much so. I'm someone, as you said, who likes to speak out. I'm known for speaking very freely. And look, it's great to have your own enterprise, start your own media company. I'm 44 years old. I've worked for the BBC, for Sky, for Al Jazeera English, for NBC, for HuffPost. And it's good to actually be my own boss for a little while and to be able to, especially at a time, Piers, when the world is going through so much. You have the war in Gaza, you have an election in the US, you have the rise of fascism globally. There's a lot I want to speak about, both online and in my shows and in my writing. And, you know, it is good to be uncensored, including on this show.
It certainly is. It's great to have you. Let me just take you back to October the 7th. I want you to imagine, and it's a bit of a leap, I admit.
We always have to talk about
that you are the Prime Minister of Israel
every show.
When that atrocity happens in Israel. What do you do?
That's a great question. So short answer is I resign because I'm responsible for that attack. I'm the one who botched security at the border. I'm the one who propped up Hamas with money from Qatar over the years and allowed them to be propped up as a way to divide the Palestinian people. I'm the one who's had millions of my own people on the streets for months protesting against my authoritarian reforms to the judiciary. So I have some shame, I have some self-respect, I have some honesty, and I say, I quit. Let someone else do this because I've failed for 20 years.
Okay, Netanyahu did not do that. And interestingly, although the majority of Israelis would like him to go, they also want him to finish the job in destroying Hamas. There's not much ambiguity in terms of how Israelis feel about the mission plan. But there's obviously a lot of concern mounting around the world
like it's
about the scale of Israel's response. So that's really what I guess my question was alluding to. I'll be honest, I've said this a lot on my Uncensored show, that I felt a real moral quandary. You know, I can go back over tweets I've done back in 2014, where I said that Israel's response to provocation by Palestinians at the time was bordering on terrorism. You know, I'm somebody who, when I was editor of the Daily Mirror, opposed the Iraq War before, during, and after very vociferously. And I think that aged pretty well, that campaign. I'm somebody that when the Qatar World Cup happened, you know, I sprang to defense of Qatar's right to host the World Cup and exposed a lot of Western hypocrisy.
It's like a broken record. You keep saying the same things.
I feel genuinely conflicted, for want of a better phrase. And the point of my conflict is this, really, is that the reason I asked you that question about if you were the Prime Minister of Israel, it's very, very difficult to know how any Prime Minister of Israel could have responded in a particularly different manner to the way that Netanyahu did. Putting aside all the reasons that you say he should have resigned, and by the way, I broadly agree with them. So, in terms of the Israel people, the Prime Minister at the time, the response to what happened that day was going to always have to be enormous, wasn't it?
So you're right in terms of the emotional response. It was going to be enormous. And I would take us back to 9/11, Piers. You mentioned Iraq. After 9/11, there was an emotional response in the US that something had to be done. Right? There's the famous Yes Minister dialogue. Something has to be done. This is something, let's do it. And we invaded Afghanistan, which didn't solve the problem of terrorism, made it worse, punished innocent people who had nothing to do with 9/11. And you'll remember at the time, Piers, both parties in the United States supported going into Afghanistan. Only one member of Congress, not Bernie Sanders, Barbara Lee of California, voted to oppose that war. 2 decades on, many people would say she was vindicated, even though she was an isolated voice and she was going against a tidal wave of opinion from liberals and conservatives said, we have to do something. And I get that. After an atrocity happens, people want to do something. But the best leaders, the most strategic leaders, the most moral leaders are the ones who can take a pause, take a breath, and say, are we going to make the situation better or worse? Are we striking out strategically or just for the sake of vengeance and revenge?
Good
and you
point.
talk about Israeli prime ministers having to do this. Look, they didn't have to do it on this level. I think a lot of Israelis, despite supporting Netanyahu, would argue it didn't have to be done like this. There are different ways to retaliate against Hamas. The irony is no Israeli government has done it like this before. This is the greatest death toll for Palestinians of any war in Israel's post-1948 history. So the fact that he did it like this was unique. I mean, look, the statistics speak for themselves, Piers. You know them. You've said them on this show.
Yeah.
The level of killing, the number of kids killed. You have one former UN official saying this is the highest kill rate in the world since Rwanda, right? Of any conflict since Rwanda. Do not tell me that the only response to a brutal attack on civilians in Israel on October the 7th was to produce a conflict that had a kill rate equivalent to Rwanda's. Sorry, I don't accept that.
Here's what I would say, playing
Exactly.
devil's advocate, and you might think, I'm literally playing devil's advocate, but I'm going to play it anyway, which is, all that is true, the death toll is horrific, the percentage of children being killed is horrific. But I would say, as a caveat to this, that if you think about it from the Israeli perspective, you've got 35,000 Hamas terrorists, and we'll come to whether you think they're terrorists or not in a moment, but you've got 35,000 Hamas soldiers, warriors, terrorists, whatever description you want to call them, depending on whose side you're on. And they are embedded amongst a civilian population where half that population is under 18. How else do you get rid of Hamas if you don't go about it in the blunt, brutal manner that Israel is doing? And if you do it the way they're doing it, how do you avoid the kind of casualty rate of people under 18, given that that's half the population?
So, three things very briefly. Number one, you do it by not deliberately targeting civilian targets and schools and hospitals and cemeteries and mosques and universities and churches. You don't have snipers shooting at hospitals or Christian women inside a church. That's how you avoid the casualties. Number two, I don't accept the premise of your question that this is the way to defeat Hamas. I think even if I'm an Israeli hawk, I criticize Netanyahu and say, this is not the way to defeat Hamas. This is actually absurd to think you can defeat Hamas in this way. We have countless episodes from history that show us this is not how you defeat a guerrilla movement, a resistance movement, a terror group, as you say, whatever word you want to use. In fact, you have Israeli generals saying this can't be done in this way. And number three, look, the reality is Hamas is a symptom of the problem. As long as you treat Hamas as a problem rather than as a symptom of the problem, you're never going to get rid of Hamas. Or if you do, by some fantasy means, get rid of Hamas, you'll just get another version of Hamas, because now you've got tens of thousands of orphans, you've got people who've lost their kids, their spouses, their siblings. What, you think they're not going to fight back in the years to come? You think they're not going to take revenge?
Well, that's how I feel.
It's absolute madness to believe.
I feel the same way.
So we agree.
So yeah, I think broadly speaking I do, because I think you can't kill the ideology, and in fact all you will do is entrench the ideology. I think, and that's what I don't think Israel have thought through to a logical end game, which is you're not going to get rid of the thinking that inspired Hamas, because a lot of people will have suffered such appalling grief with their close family in the way you described, that they're going to want to get revenge.
I think you're being a little too generous to the Israelis here, and with the greatest respect, I think your questions reflect a little bit of a naivety about what Israel's doing here. You're starting from the premise that Israel is trying to defeat Hamas. I don't accept that premise. I don't believe that's what Israel is trying to do. You think they're trying to do it? They wouldn't be doing it this way. I think they're trying to take back Gaza. I think they're trying to raise the resistance in Gaza. I think they're trying to get rid of the people from Gaza. I think this is they've mowed the lawn, as they put it in previous wars. This time they're going in to erase the population. There's a plausible genocide.
Okay, but let me ask you that.
If you listen to Israeli officials, as you know, it's laid out in the South African petition, they are very genocidal in their approach to flattening and burning down Gaza. It's not about destroying Hamas. And if it was about destroying Hamas, why has Netanyahu and Smotrich and others talked about how Hamas is an asset to Israel? Why do they say that openly, Piers?
Well, he was clearly massively deluded, I think, Netanyahu, about having anything to do with Hamas. I think that Netanyahu's plan was quite straightforward, which was to separate Hamas from the Palestinian Authority and create a split in the Palestinians at an official level. And he thought that was the best way of preserving security for Israel. He couldn't have been more wrong. I mean, the thing I do want to ask you, I don't think you've called Hamas terrorists. In fact, you've gone out of your way to call them fighters. Do you still think that? Or do you accept that what they did on October the 7th was an act of terrorism on a heinous scale, and therefore you have to call them terrorists?
So you're wrong, Piers. In my very first MSNBC monologue after October 7th, I referred to what happened on October 7th as terrorism. In fact, when I was 16 years old, I wrote a letter to the Independent newspaper condemning Hamas bus bombings in the mid-1990s. So you're wrong on multiple levels. I don't expect you to know about my 16-year-old self, but clearly my MSNBC output is all there for anyone to see.
So just to be clear, it was an act of terrorism, and Hamas are terrorists. That's your position.
I think the Hamas fighters who went into Israel and killed civilians and kidnapped babies, certainly I would call them terrorists. Just as I call Israeli soldiers who kidnap children and kill children terrorists. I use the terrorist label more freely because otherwise it's just a politicized, empty phrase that we just apply to our enemies. What I would say, Piers, is that I find it a problem, and you know this, you've joked about all the memes about you, this obsession with what we call Hamas, which is a question you pose, let's be honest, Piers, to most of your pro-Palestinian brown guests. You don't ask your Israeli or Jewish or pro-Israeli guests to condemn Israeli terrorism or Israeli war crimes at the start of an interview in the way you do.
I've been asked directly whether I think Israel are terrorists, and I've said no. So I don't think they are. I think they had a right to defend themselves.
Double standard.
That wasn't the point I made, Piers.
No,
that wasn't the point I made. I said when you have Israeli guests on. Let me finish my sentence.
No, Mehdi, it's not your show. It's mine. I wanted to say that, or the whole interview, by the way. So you got that out of the way. That's a joke. I'm joking. But the point I would make is, I think that I asked all the pro-Palestinian guests who've come on that question quite quickly, because I think it reveals a state of mind. If, like you, and I'm sorry, I didn't realise you had in that first piece on MSNBC done that. So I take back the suggestion you hadn't. And I'm glad that you have called them that. I don't think you can call them anything else. So the moment you have a pro-Palestinian guest who wants to avoid calling what Hamas did an act of terrorism by terrorists, I think it's very revealing about their mindset. And I think it's the wrong mindset.
Here's my problem with that. Why is that not
you have the wrong mindset also,
I would be fine, Piers, if you had Palestinian guests and you begin by asking them, do you condemn Hamas war crimes? Because what Hamas did on October 7th was a war crime. But then you should start with Israeli guests and pro-Israeli guests saying, do you condemn Israeli war crimes, which have been documented by the UN, every human rights group on the planet? You don't. You had Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli Prime Minister, on a couple of weeks ago. I watched the interview. Your opening question was, how comfortable are you with the way Israel's prosecuting the war? Right. Bit of a softball to start with. You didn't ask him to condemn Israeli terrorism, Israeli war crimes, Israeli genocide in Gaza. So a lot of people look at that and they say, they get your intention, but it comes across as a bit of a racist double standard.
Well, look, I don't think it's a racist double standard, and I think that nobody has given pro-Palestinian voices a bigger platform more consistently since October the 7th than me. And if you go back and look at those interviews, I think that clips get taken out of context and people assume they know what I've said. And often it's completely misleading. I've tried to be fair-minded about it. People do ask me, do you think Israel are terrorists? And I've said no, I don't think they are. But I have repeated. Why? Well, I have repeated because I think they.
Out of interest, why?
Because they were responding to an act of terrorism so heinous it demanded a massive military response. The question for me that caused me a moral quandary is what is an acceptably proportionate level of response, and I don't know the answer. But I don't think you can call people responding to an act of terror on that scale terrorists for responding. What you can do is hold them to account.
The problem, Piers, is if you go to Gaza, Piers, and you talk to Palestinians, they will say that Hamas were responding. If we play the who started it game, we go back many decades.
Well, when did Israel kill?
What we need to have is.
Hang on. When did Israel kill 1,200 Palestinians?
Hundreds of Palestinian civilians.
When did they kill 800 Palestinian civilians in one few-hour period? Right, in the way that Hamas killed
That's the definition of terrorism, how many hours you do it in. I can mention many Israeli massacres going back to Sabra and Shatila, which they oversaw, going back to Kibbutz and Ariel Sharon, going back to Deir Yassin, where rape and violence happened. The point is not to compare atrocities. The point, Piers, is to have a consistent moral principle, which is to say, if you kill civilians for a political cause, you are a terrorist. On that basis, Hamas have committed acts of terror and Israel have committed acts of terror. I think that's only fair to say that.
Yeah, listen, you're perfectly entitled to say it. Of course you are.
People have to say that killing is wrong.
On Sunday,
that's
Jonathan
obvious.
Glazer won an award for Best International Film for The Zone of Interest, a movie about the Holocaust. And he's a director. He said this when he was on stage.
Our film shows where dehumanization leads at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people. Whether the victims of October the 7th in Israel, or the ongoing attack on Gaza, all are victims of this dehumanization. How do we resist?
Now, that prompted a lot of reaction, as you'd imagine. New York Post columnist John Poderet said on X, Jonathan Glazer, you can go bleep yourself and stuff your Oscar up your bleep, to which you replied, cry more. Ben Shapiro where next in Jonathan Glazer's zone of interest, you don't see one Jew. These are the best Jews, according to Glazer, the faceless victims screaming in the distance. Ironically, he's the villain, picking up awards from the bodies of these anonymous dead Jews while ignoring the living ones getting slaughtered in the Gaza envelope by genocidal murderers. Listen, you've seen the way that debate played out. Interestingly to me, before we get to what Glazer said, I've been really struck by the fact that throughout the entire Hollywood award season, be it movies, television, music, I don't think there's been a single statement by a big star about the Israel-Hamas war, which is pretty well unprecedented for the biggest bunch of virtue signalers in the world. A, what do you read into that? And secondly, on Glazer's speech, was that the right time and place to say it? And what do you think of the reaction from prominent Jews to what he said?
Well, let's work backwards. Yes, it was the right time to say it. Why not? And I've been depressed to see that the award ceremony season has not seen anyone mention an ongoing genocide in the Middle East,
I agree.
in which 12,500 children minimum have been killed in the space of a few months. So I'm happy he did it. I find the controversy to be manufactured. I find it deeply dishonest. You have people like Meghan McCain and others tweeting that he said he refutes his Jewishness. Just flat false. I'm glad you posted and played the whole clip, Piers, because a lot of people have been very sneaky in posting a portion of his statement to make it sound like he was refuting his own Jewishness. What he said, as we all saw, is he refutes his Jewishness being hijacked by the occupation, which is how a lot of Jewish people, a lot of young Jewish people, especially in the United States, feel. And that's why so many of us who are critics of Israel say, let us disentangle the political ideology of Zionism being pushed in the occupied territories from Judaism, one of the world's great religions, which is not responsible for the crimes of Benjamin Netanyahu or Bezalel Smotrich. So I think he's been completely smeared, and I hope he sues some of these people. Number two, in terms of Hollywood, for 4 years of Trump, Hollywood celebrities spoke out against fascism, authoritarianism, human rights abuses at the border. And now suddenly they've all lost their voices, which tells you a great deal about how this issue is so censored in the US, to use a phrase that you like. It's not uncensored. We know that people in Hollywood, in the media, in politics, elsewhere, do feel a pressure not to speak out on this, do get worried about losing career opportunities. My good friend Mark Ruffalo was up for an Oscar yesterday. I was hoping he'd win because he's one of those bold folks who does speak about Gaza and Palestinians. I know he would have devoted his speech to it. Sadly, he lost to his fellow Marvel character, Robert Downey Jr. But look, it's a real problem that in Hollywood there is so much censorship.
I wish more people would speak out.
Artists for free speech. And I'm glad Annie Lennox spoke out. I'm glad Jonathan Glazer spoke out. I just wish more people were.
Kinda frustrated watching this because this is what Piers Morgan does is he keeps repeating the same thing. When he talks to a pro-Palestinian, he has the same sentences again and again and again. And it doesn't solve anything. It just talks about, do you condemn Hamas? October 7. What about what's happening right now? For him and for them, October the 7th is the only day that matters, the only day. And then they ignore the other days and they say, oh, I have a moral quandary or something, I don't know. Like, I'm so tired of this. Like, I'm so tired of people just like having a blind eye and no, that's not terrorism because they are brown and they are like, are you joking? Like over 10,000 children have been killed. Like, are you joking? You don't call that terrorism? Like, why do people have to say that this is wrong? Why do, like, killing innocent civilians is wrong, okay? No matter who it is, no matter which side, this will never be justified, okay? You cannot justify it, not even with saying it's a response, because it didn't start on October 7th. It started way before, and even before Hamas existed. Oh my God. Oh my gosh. I'm really glad that he had Mehdi Hassan on his show. Mehdi Hassan, he brought some very good points, like I agree with him. I'm really glad he brought up like all these double standards of Piers, like how he talks to Israelis versus pro-Palestinian people on his show. It's just so obvious, like Piers is like, or pro-Israel, like maybe because he's getting paid, you know. Allah knows best. Yeah, anyway, that's all I can say. Thank you for watching this video. Oh, it's so dark. Yeah, the lighting is not the best, but anyway, see you next time, inshallah. I don't know when I will make another video, but hopefully soon. Assalamu alaikum.